Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where we do a fair and objective analysis of the church and its truth claims, its history, doctrine, and policy. And I'm excited for tonight's guest. We have historian and author Todd Compton with us. Todd, thanks for coming on.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Todd Compton, he is an author of In Sacred Loneliness, which is a very famous book on the wives of Joseph Smith, and it talks about Joseph Smith's polygamy. And he's also got a recent book, In Sacred Loneliness, The Documents. So we're going to promote those books. There's the copy of it there, and you can get that on, I think, Amazon and Signature Books as well. So I'll put links in the description where people can
Benchmark
get that.
books also. Yeah.
Awesome. So on my channel, we've been covering polygamy. I've done my own sort of multi-episode series looking at all sort of like the controversial aspects of it. We've also done an interview with Brian Hales, who has done a lot of work himself and written a 3-volume series on Joseph Smith's polygamy. And as I'm going through this, I want to try to talk to historians and experts and to get their take on it. So this will be a really fun interview as we talk about Joseph Smith's polygamy and the wives of Joseph Smith. But before we get into that, Todd, can you tell us just a little bit about your background? Growing up in the church, you told me that you served a mission in Ireland, which is pretty cool. So I want you to talk about that. So we already have like a connection going on there. And then what led you to become a historian and to write the book about Joseph Smith's wives?
Okay. Yeah. I was raised in the church. I was born in Provo, Utah, and that's kind of like my hometown.
In the Mormon
Um,
bubble.
yeah. My dad ended up teaching there. So I went to Provo High and so on and BYU. And then,
Was he a professor?
yeah, he was a professor. He taught Spanish. And so everyone thought I would be going to a Spanish speaking mission, but nope, they sent
No.
me to Ireland. And let's see, I guess we can go right there. Yeah, I went to Ireland on my mission.
Yeah.
And so that was exciting. It wasn't a mission where, like I hear about some of these Southern American missions where you had, 2 or 3 baptisms every week.
Oh, definitely
It
not.
was more like I actually performed one baptism, I think, in the 2 years I was there.
That's pretty
And
normal. Like there's some missionaries who I think probably have struggled to even get a baptism. Like it's
yeah,
a tough mission.
right, yeah. But it was wonderful. The people were wonderful, and I have lots of fun stories I could tell. One is I remember I went to Dublin first for a couple months, and got used to the accent, and then they sent me to Cork,
Oh wow,
and
yeah.
the people in Cork started talking, and I was like, you know, what language are these people speaking? Is this French?
Is this Gaelic?
It was really hard to understand.
Because they're like
And
high-pitched
then,
leprechauns down in Cork, aren't they?
yeah, yeah. And then it was, then he got used to it after a week or two,
Yeah.
and it sounded normal, But then, of course, they sent me up to Rathcoole outside of Belfast, and again, it was like, whoa, what language are these people speaking? So,
Yeah. It's a
um,
peculiar accent because it's not one that you would hear much on TV, like if you're from the States. So yeah, it's different. And there's so many accents. Like if you go to a different county, if you just go like 20 minutes up the road, the accent will change.
yeah, yeah, and I remember talking to people in Cork, and they said, "Oh yeah, we know what part of the city a person will be because of his accent." And I knew that from Dublin, like northern Dublin accent is quite different than southern Dublin. Anyway, so that's just a fun part of my Irish experience. But
And there's probably a lot
uh,
of religious division as well. Like it was probably hard, you know, converting people because they're very strongly Protestant or very strongly Catholic. And you also mentioned that you were there in the midst of the troubles happening.
right, yeah. So yeah, we could easily talk for an hour about Ireland.
Oh, easy.
But I was in Rathcoole for about half a year, 5 months, I think. So I got to understand the Northern Ireland quite a bit,
Yeah.
at least 5 months worth.
Did you go to
And
like the Giant's Causeway or around the North Coast or
no, I
any?
never got, no, I never got
No?
there.
Oh
No.
no. You have to come back to visit.
Yeah, okay. I'll do that. Okay, I'll come knock on your door. Put me up
Yeah.
for put me up for a month.
Yeah, that would be fun.
um, but it was I was talking with Stephen about the Troubles, and they were, you had bombings and you had shootings, and so it was. I'm glad that things are better now, but
Yeah,
it
it's a lot
was,
safer.
yeah. Um, so you do, um, yeah. I think people are getting used to the Northern Ireland accent because of Derry Girls. Have you seen any Derry
Yeah,
Girls episodes?
I love Derry Girls. It's so funny. And the Derry accent is so much different to like I'm from Portadown or like the Belfast accent. It's different. But my best friends are from or one of my best friends, he's from Derry. And yeah, I love the Derry accent. It's a funny show. So wacky.
Yeah. So anyway, I went to Ireland. I was at 6 months in Cork and 6 months total in Dublin. And
Yeah.
so
So good mission experience. Probably lots of
yeah,
reading. Um, yeah.
yeah, great place,
And then so
beautiful
after
place.
yeah. So then tell us about after your mission, sort of what happened next.
Okay, well, so I came home from my mission, and I've always been interested in just obvious anyone in Mormon church. You have this interest in Mormon history because it's kind of almost part of the doctrine, the history of the church. The persecutions in Kirtland in Missouri and Nauvoo and crossing the
Yeah,
plains,
it's
and
our heritage.
yeah, and Utah history. And so I was exposed to all that. And I came home and I got interest. I remember they started doing this thing called Sunstone Symposiums. And so I went to some of the really early ones. And when they had a session on history, I found that I was really interested in those. So I would go to those. And so I would start picking up a background in Mormon history. But I got interested in the ancient world, and so I ended up majoring finally in Greek and Latin classics. And at the same time, I'm kind of picking up a background in Mormon history. And I remember reading Michael Quinn's article on post-manifesto polygamy, which is really, in dialogue, which is really an eye opener.
Yeah.
And I came to have a sense of Mormon leaders as very human,
Mm,
okay, very fallible. So um, that at the same time, I was a fairly I was a liberal person who was attending church and so on. And
right.
so anyway, I did my grad work at UCLA, and then um, kind of ended up, the job market was tough. I taught for a year at USC, but then I ended up without a good place for a job. And I was just right there at UCLA. And that was a tough period of my life. And I wrote a little essay on how I wrote In Sacred Loneliness um, in this book, Writing Mormon History.
Ah,
Is is do you see the writing backwards?
nope, no, I can see it.
Oh, okay. For me, the writing is backwards. And when I wrote this book about writing in sacred loneliness, and one of my possible titles that I was thinking of was "The Blessings of Failure," because if everything had gone the way I'd planned it, if I'd gotten a job teaching Greek and Latin, and left the LA area, I never would have written In Sacred Loneliness. So granted that you think writing In Sacred Loneliness was a good thing, which I kind of do with my
Yeah.
bias, author bias. It never
And
would have happened if I'd been successful, you know.
yeah, no, it's interesting how life can work out like that. So did you know about, obviously, I'm sure you knew about polygamy growing up, but did you know that Joseph Smith was a polygamist? And what caused you to want to write a book about the plural wives of Joseph Smith? And what was sort of people's reactions to you to you doing that?
Um, I don't remember. I think I did know that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, but polygamy was not a major interest in mine, you know, though I had this, you know, as part of Mormon history, I kind of had this background in knowing about it and in reading about it. Um, but I remember I ran into one of my friends, a woman, and she was really antagonistic to polygamy. And I thought, oh, that's strange, you know, you know, because with me, I hadn't thought about it much. And but so what happened? But all the time, I'm getting more and more liberal because of my background in Sunstone and dialogue, you know, and I ended up giving papers at Sunstone and so on. And so at the same time, so what happened was, and again, you can read the whole story at length in that book edited by Joe Geisner, which is a great book. I don't know if you've read it yet, but
No, I'll
you know,
put the
there's
link in for it in the description.
yeah,
Writing Mormon history.
a lot of really fine historians, including Brian Hales, who you mentioned, Will Bagley, Bill McKinnon, Mike Quinn, have articles in here about how they started to write their books.
Yeah.
You know, and it's so anyway. Um, the story is there in greater length, but more briefly here. I had a friend who I knew from the singles ward in LA, and she had ended up going back to Utah, and she went to University of Utah and got a PhD in history, Mormon history, kind of. And so she contacted me, and um, I think we were talking at some points, but she actually wrote a letter to me, and she said, Todd, at the Huntington Library, which is in kind of the Pasadena area close to LA, they have the Eliza R. Snow Diaries. Why don't you apply for a summer fellowship at the Huntington Library and to work on the Eliza R. Snow Diaries? Because at that point they hadn't been published.
Mm-hmm.
And, um, so um, she wrote me a letter and talked about things I could say, and so I just basically it didn't look like it would take much time to submit this, and I thought, you know, I'll never get this because I have no background in Mormon history, and but I said it looked like it wouldn't take long to to do this submission, so I did the submission and then forgot about it. And I actually used some of the things she'd written and used what she'd written to do the submission, my friend Janet. And so I'd totally forgotten about that I'd applied for this and didn't expect to get anything. But strangely enough, a letter came in the mail and they said they'd given me the fellowship to work on Eliza R. Snow.
Oh.
And so I I thought, well, this is great. They're paying me to go there and do research. And I got interested in women's studies at UCLA, and I had some really good friends who were women who knew a lot about the important books in feminist studies, and so I'd started to know a little bit of background about, you know, women's uh, women's history and writing women's history. And I think this is one of the reasons Janet suggested I do Eliza R. Snow. But so I thought, well, this is great. They're paying me to go to this beautiful, the beautiful Huntington Library and Gardens um, and do research there. So I said, okay. So I went and I started working on the Eliza R. Snow diaries. And so that Huntington has a great Mormon collection, and they had the diaries that Eliza R. Snow wrote when she was crossing the plains. So the very first day I sat down and requested this diary. And so I had in my hand the little diary that Eliza R. Snow actually wrote in with her. So you could read her small handwriting. And I knew what was happening was like she was writing this around the campfire at night. And so it was kind of exciting to hold that in my hands and to start to read it. So I made a transcription of it and started working on it. And one of the things you have to do when you're editing a text is you have to explain everything that the reader might not understand. And one of those is the people that are mentioned. So if Eliza R. Snow says, Sister Buell visited me today and shared some food with me or whatever, I knew that I would have to explain who Sister Buell was. And so what I realized I had to do is Eliza R. Snow I knew was a plural wife of Joseph Smith, had been, and now was a plural wife of Brigham Young. And I felt like I needed really good lists of the plural wives of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't find a really good up-to-date scholarly list of Joseph Smith's wives. And so I found one list in Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History, but I felt it was really out of date, and she didn't have access to church archives when she wrote that appendix that has the list of Joseph Smith's wives. And it was really dependent on a lot of late secondhand sources that were anti-Mormon,
right,
were really biased. And so I used that, but I really didn't trust it. And so I started creating my own list of Joseph Smith's wives. And when I was doing that, you want to have the full name, the birth date, death date, and for a woman to get the to get the full name, you had to have her married names. So this woman I just mentioned, Sister Buell, who would be Presendia, and you wanted to have her birth name, of course. So Sister Buell her actual name was Presendia Lathrop Huntington Buell Smith. She married Joseph Smith Kimball. Joseph Smith died and she married Kimball. And
all last names.
yeah. And so, for some of these women married two or three men because either they separated or the men died.
Yeah.
And so,
because my understanding is a lot of Joseph Smith's plural wives, Brigham Young, married, or
right,
maybe people like Heber C. Kimball.
Right. And other apostles.
Mm-hmm.
And but so a woman might in Missouri, she might be called by one last name, and then in Nauvoo, then that husband might die and she remarried, and so in Nauvoo she'd be known by another last name.
Right.
And so to keep these women straight, you needed a good history of their marriages and and their names. And so that's what I started doing. And that led me, in your words, down the rabbit hole. And
Yeah.
so when I started doing that, it got really interesting. It was a really interesting historical job, a historical pursuit. And so what started out as just all I wanted was the full names, birth date, last death date, birth date, death date. I found out that it really took a lot of research just to do that. But um, kind of to do that, you kind of had to know about their life history, like okay, so this woman has four different names. What happened to the first husband? What happened to the second husband? And eventually I was able to piece together the full lives and the full names of these women, but it took more than just looking it up. Like the internet was barely going at that point, and I had a great library with the Huntington Library, but
Yeah.
as I say, there was no good um, list of Joseph Smith's wives where I could just look it up. And one example from Fawn Brody is there's this one woman who married about four husbands, four or five husbands. And so she was known by different names throughout history, throughout Mormon history. And so Fawn Brody, she has her as her number 18 under one name, one married name. And then she has the same woman as number 36 under another married name.
Right. Okay. Not
Okay.
realizing it was the same woman.
Right. And so to get these women straight, I began trying to track down anything they'd written, anything their family had written. And I found it, the Huntington Library. They, as I say, they had a really good Mormon collection. And so I could just start reading their diaries. And I found the Eliza Partridge um, Smith Lyman diary, which is this really wonderful diary. Um, and she ends up in southeastern Utah, which was really a pioneer story at that point. Um, and so I was just sitting there at the Huntington Library, and they gave me all the time I wanted, and so I could just read that diary, take my time and read it. And then after I read that diary, then I could go back and fill in my little history a little bit.
Hmm.
And they also had I've mentioned Presendia Huntington Buell Smith Kimball, and her sister was Zina Diantha Huntington Jacobs Smith Young. Okay, and she ended up as the third General Relief Society president of the LDS Church. So, in her own right, she's quite an important person
Yeah.
historically. But anyway, they both Presendia and Zina had these complex marriages with Joseph Smith and a first husband.
Right.
So, I call it polyandry, meaning the woman is married to two men at the same time. Okay. And
And your
people
list, you have what, 33 or is it 34 plural wives of Joseph
33.
Smith? And
Right. Yeah.
I think in your book, is it 11? I think Brian Hales said there's about 14 women that he counts that were sealed to Joseph Smith who had living legal husbands. Does that sort of align with your number
Yeah.
between
Yeah.
11 to 14?
Yeah. So I ended up with 33 who I felt could be really well documented as Joseph Smith's wives.
Yeah.
But, um, and of them, like something like 12 or 13, yeah, were polyandrous. So
Which is
let's see.
new to a lot of people. I might have been aware that I knew Brigham Young was a polygamist. I don't think I really knew Joseph Smith was, but I definitely
Uh,
didn't know about the term polyandry. But it seems like your book, you're trying to capture the experiences, the journals,
yeah.
the accounts, the stories of the wives of Joseph Smith and to really hear it from their perspective, because sometimes we have a tendency that we can focus on the men, we can focus on, you know,
Yeah.
Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, and that's something that's really important as well. So maybe we could start with
But
so
let me go back to
we'll go back to
Zina
what you're
and
saying. Yes.
Presendia real quick.
Yeah.
And at the Huntington Library, they had the diaries of their brother, Oliver Huntington.
Right.
And since he's a man, you know, fortunately, his name never changes. His last name never changed.
Easier to remember.
And so I read through the whole diary of Oliver Huntington, and it really helped me piece together what was happening with his sisters' lives.
Yeah.
And so anyway, these small, you know, at first it was just going to be a list, and then, you know, each name became a paragraph, and then I just these paragraphs got bigger and bigger, and I got it was really exciting to find out about their life stories, and I got really emotionally connected with some of these women because they wrote such wonderful things. And Eliza Partridge Lyman is one example of that. And so that's basic, you know. And then I turned from I it turned out Maureen Ursenbach Beecher was actually editing the diaries of Eliza R. Snow. So we contacted, and so um, so I kind of helped her with finish up Eliza, and she helped me with, you know, what I was focusing on, the plural wives of Joseph Smith.
Right.
And so that's kind of how the book started. Okay, and now back to what your question was. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So polygamy. So we know polygamy was practiced. It was practiced in the Bible, in the Old Testament. You know, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, David, Solomon were polygamists. And the Book of Mormon sort of condemns polygamy. You know, David and Solomon's practice of polygamy as, you know, being sort of abomination. There is that scripture that's sort of like a clause that, you know, unless the Lord commands it to raise a righteous seed, they are to adhere to monogamy. One of the questions I have in my mind is, you know, where did the polygamy revelation begin? You know, some faithful historians would view it as when Joseph Smith was translating, going through the Bible. I know at the beginning of D&C 132, it talks about, well, the Lord said that the revelation came in response to Joseph Smith inquiring about, you know, why he justified, you know, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses in having many wives. And I know the church alludes to that, although the revelation didn't come until 1843, there's evidence that he might have been teaching it by 1831. And there's also, I believe, a statement, a letter by, I think it was W.W. Phelps and Ezra Booth, that Joseph Smith pretty much told them that when they were, you know, being missionaries and trying to convert the Lamanites, that they could take some of them for wives. Where do you see the polygamy sort of doctrine or revelation? What do you think the origin was, or can we know with any certainty?
So that's a really good overview. So I kind of agree with that overview
Thanks.
you had. So you know, some people some historians kind of start the Bloomy story in Nauvoo, you know, but I think it goes back to Kirtland and Missouri.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and I think Joseph Smith was very influenced by the Old Testament. And and you can see that in prophets and temples, which are very characteristic of the Old Testament. And also Abraham was a really important prophet in the Judaic tradition.
Yeah.
And Abraham, of course, was a polygamist. And so I think that had a deep impact on Joseph Smith back in the Kirtland era. And that's when he was developing the his theology of polygamy.
Mm.
However, a lot of these sources are fairly late. Okay, and I I use late sources, and but you know, sometimes they're problematic. Sometimes, yeah, for late sources, if you can have a more contemporary source, it's good to back it up.
Yeah,
You know, so I'm just,
more reliable if it's contemporary soon after the time, because there's a lot of people who I would sometimes get commenting on my videos who would say Joseph Smith was never a polygamist. All these sources, they're late, long after the fact. You know, it was Brigham Young who was the polygamist, and they're all later trying to act that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. Now, to me, that just seems like one huge conspiracy. But it would have been better if there had been more, contemporary writings of it.
yeah. Um, and let me just give my one little example. My dad was, he was involved in World War II to the extent that they were training him to become an airplane mechanic. And and the war ended before he had to actually go, you know, do any of that, use that training. However, I remember one time he was visiting our apartment in Bay Area here, and I asked him, Dad, tell me what happened, you know, your experiences, you know, in World War II. And so he sat down and he went to different training places throughout America. So he sat down and he described each place he went to and the people he knew there, and the people who were, you know, very nice to him and friendly to him, and so on. And so, you know, he went for like a half an hour, and I took notes and on my computer. And you know, this was 50 years after the experience he had. And so that record I have of his, I think, is a really valuable
Yeah.
record. And he was not making it up. You know, his memory was really good. And so late evidence can be helpful and valuable. And you can't just
Dismisses a later
reject it all.
fabrication.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if you have good reason to reject it, like if there's a major conflict with other evidence, um, you know, then you can, you know, try to figure out why this person was lying or something like that. But
Yeah.
anyway, so I use late evidence, though I try to back it up with more contemporary evidence when possible. Okay, how'd we get onto that?
I don't know. So getting back,
Oh, people
the
who
revelation, we think
uh,
originated, you think probably when he was looking at the Bible, inquiring
right.
about the Old Testament patriarchs. It seems like he didn't act upon plural
So
marriage.
yeah,
Um,
so I accept that he was involved in polygamy in
yes,
Kirtland with Fanny Alger.
yes. Could you talk a wee bit
And
about that relationship? I know that's one where there's a lot of dispute between critics and apologists. Was it a plural marriage? Was it an adulterous affair? And also when did it when was the date? Was it 1833 or was it closer to 1836? Maybe just talk a little bit about your take on Fanny Alger.
yeah, so one of the exciting experiences I had when I was doing research, and I started at the Huntington Library, but then of course I went to a whole bunch of other libraries, and spent a lot of time at the Church History Library archives. Um, and one experience I had was I was trying to find out all I could about Fanny Alger, of course. And so I knew that um, there were these kind of books by her relatives, the Hancocks, that were published as typescripts. And in one of them, Levi Hancock, he mentions Fanny Alger. He said, Joseph Smith asked me to take care of Fanny Alger, and as they were leaving Kirtland and so on. And I thought, oh, what's this connection of Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger here? And of course, I knew that other sources had connected Fanny Alger to Joseph Smith as a wife.
Hmm.
And so I thought maybe I could find more about Fanny Alger in the writings of Levi Hancock. And so I looked up that exact same document that had, well, I was looking at, I guess, the writings of Levi Hancock, who was Fanny Alger's uncle, and Mosiah Hancock, who is the son of Levi, were kind of connected. So I was looking up the Mosiah Hancock autobiography, which had been published as a typescript. You know, it was kind of like a family publication or something like that. So anyway, I looked it up to see what it was like in the actual writing of Mosiah Hancock, what we call the autograph. And so I started reading that, and it was amazing. There was a whole story of the marriage of Fanny Alger to Joseph Smith in the autograph that had not got into the typescript. Like the family people who were doing this typescript, they came along and said, "Oh, we won't put that. We won't put that in this publication here." And but anyway, it talks about how Levi Hancock, the uncle of Fanny Alger, performed the marriage of Fanny to Joseph Smith. And again, it's late, but you know, I took it seriously then, and I do now.
Yeah.
And I think anyone needs to take it seriously. And you might say,
It's a cool find. That's
you might,
really,
yeah, it was exciting. And you know, you might say, well, we think that Mosiah Hancock just liked to tell tall stories, and we reject it. But you know, I accepted it. And
yeah.
so if it was connected with the marriage of Levi Hancock to Clarissa Reed, I think was her name. And so that took place in 1833. So if you accept the Mosiah Hancock / Levi Hancock account, you kind of have to date that marriage to 1833.
Right.
So some people accept that story. Like, it's interesting. Some people accept it, some don't. But Mike Quinn accepted it. Richard Bushman accepts it. Brian Hales accepts it. However, they don't. Brian Hales doesn't accept that 1833 date.
No, I think when we had our interview, he leaned more towards 1835,
Yeah.
1836. Why do you think he would lean more to a later date? Could you talk a little bit about that? And I know some critics would say, well, how could Joseph have been sealed or married to Fanny Alger before the sealing power was restored in 1836? And perhaps that's a reason to try to push it further back. Do you have any idea why they don't want to say it could have been 1833?
Uh, well, at, I guess some of the reasons you just mentioned. I guess he thinks it fits more other elements of Joseph Smith's story if you put it in 1835, 1836.
Because when did she leave? Was it about around 1836 when she got kicked out by Emma when she was discovered, her and Joseph in
Oh
the
yeah,
barn?
yeah,
So maybe he
yeah.
would see it as that would be hard to keep it hidden for so many years.
It's kind of interesting. It's kind of quite parallel to the Emily Partridge, Eliza Partridge stories in that Emily and Eliza were living in Joseph Smith's home, kind of as servants, kind
Yeah,
of like his nannies. And apparently, same thing was happening with Fanny Alger in Kirtland, and so the story is kind of parallel. And just as in Nauvoo, Emma required Joseph Smith to kick out Emily and Eliza. Kind of the same thing happened in Kirtland with Fanny Alger. And of course, this is late evidence.
yeah.
Okay. But, I accept it. And
doesn't Emily write in her journal that both her and her sister separately were approached by Joseph about being a plural wife, and he then married and was sealed to both of them without Emma's knowledge or awareness. And then Emma, whenever she was allowed to pick wives for Joseph Smith, I think this was around May 1843, he then had a second marriage to the Partridge sisters, unknown to Emma that he was already sealed them. So it was sort of like a pretend second marriage, which I find a little bit troubling. It does seem, it is deceptive. And there's that pattern of, servants or hired girls in the home that were sort of teenagers that he was sort of marrying without his wife's awareness or permission.
yeah, and so the pattern, I believe, started in Kirtland with Fanny Alger.
Yeah.
And just to continue the story of Fanny Alger,
Oh, yes, yeah.
You don't know, she and her family left Kirtland, but she went to where was it, in Indiana, and she stopped in Indiana and she met someone, a non-Mormon, Solomon Custer, and so she married this non-Mormon and stayed in Indiana, and then raised a family there.
And she never said or wrote anything about Joseph Smith or their relationship.
No. So in this book, what I've done is I've collected all the writings of the women themselves. Okay. And so some women wrote a lot and some women didn't write anything, or if they wrote anything, it hasn't been saved to my knowledge. And so nothing that Fanny Alger wrote that I know of, no letters, no diaries. So it's
it's a controversial one, isn't it? Because there's limited sources on it. It's good that we have the one from Uzziah Hancock, which would support there being a marriage ceremony. I think there is also no account from Eliza R. Snow, where she referenced Fanny Alger as a plural wife. So there's maybe some evidence to support she was the first plural wife. Oliver Cowdery, believed it was an adulterous affair, which sort of was a possible reason for him getting excommunicated. I imagine Emma in her interview with
that letter written by Oliver Cowdery was a very contemporary document. So
yes,
that supports the idea that there was this connection of Joseph Smith and Fanny.
And he didn't buy it was a plural marriage. And in the Doctrine and Covenants section 101, the church's sort of stance was monogamy at the time, in as much as this church has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we believe that one man should have one wife. So publicly their position in scripture was at that time monogamy. So he was practicing plural marriage sort of in secret. But I believe he didn't practice plural marriage after that until Nauvoo. But you talk about that you think there is one in Missouri with, is it Lucinda Harris? Could you talk briefly about that?
Yeah, Lucinda Harris, she was the widow of the Masonic martyr. What's his name?
Oh,
his name is escaping me. Morgan, was it Morgan?
Morgan was, yeah, something more. Wasn't William Morgan, was it?
Yeah, I should know. But anyway, she was the widow of the Masonic martyr. So I tell that story in my book. And then she married someone named Harris, George Harris, who was a Mormon.
Yeah.
And so she was with the Mormons in Missouri. And so I found a couple sources that led me to believe that the marriage took place in Missouri. And then much later, after In Sacred Loneliness had been published for quite a while, Brian Hales and Don Bradley, they found the notes of Andrew Jensen. And Andrew Jensen, in the 1880s, he came up with a list of Joseph Smith's wives, and he was like an assistant church historian. So he had like about 28 people on that list. So that's a very
good
very
list.
good list. Yeah. and you can't pass it off as anti-Mormon at all. He was totally um, totally a conservative Mormon at that point, wanting to document that Joseph Smith was a polygamist.
Yeah, because they were
And
practicing polygamy at the time, so that strengthened what
right,
they were doing. Supported
right. And there
their
was this
stance.
big controversy with the RLDS Church,
Yeah,
Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who were denying that Joseph Smith had been a polygamist.
yeah.
But anyway, in his list, he has Fanny Alger, and then he has Lucinda, um, Morgan, Harris, Smith. But then Don Bradley and Brian Hales discovered the notes of Andrew Jensen. And very, very interesting, some of these notes and things that some never got published. But one of them was, he said that in these notes, he said, so and so, I forget, one of the wives of Brigham Young, I forget which wife it was, but she says that Joseph Smith was definitely married to Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris in Missouri. So that was, really valuable evidence that supported that dating. So,
And would this have
so
been
yeah,
a polyandrous marriage?
yeah, yeah, yeah. She was, the first husband was George Harris, who was a prominent Mormon. He was in the High Council when the High Council was really important. And I should mention with these polyandrous marriages that as I this was something that I wasn't expecting to find when I started my research, and it really complicated doing. I wanted these simple names, that would tell about their whole marriage history. And instead, I found out that at some points, she was married to this, who I call the first husband, and then married to Joseph Smith. And I thought, oh, did she divorce from this first husband and then marry Joseph Smith? And trying to work it out. And I found out. So I started doing residence histories and, you know, marriage histories of these women. And uh, in every case that I could document, they stayed living with the first husband at the same time they were married to Joseph Smith.
Right.
So this was a story I hadn't expected to come across, but it was, again, part of history is this detective work that's can be just fascinating. And sometimes you run across these odd, problematic things, and it's just fascinating to try to work them out, try to get all the evidence you can, and find out what was going on. And the pattern, the story that came to me was that these women were always living with their first husband. And
Mm.
one example of that was Zina Dantha Huntington Jacobs, and she was married to a Mormon named Henry Jacobs, and she stayed. She kept her diary, so we have Zina's Nauvoo diary, and she was continued to live with Henry Jacobs. And if you didn't know about the marriage to Joseph Smith, you'd just think it was a normal marriage, a happy marriage, and then you find out from other sources that she was married to Joseph Smith at this same time.
Mm. So I've talked about
So,
this with Brian Hales on polyandry, and I think the apologist view is that Joseph Smith. So he was visited by the angel three times between 1834 to 1842, and his marriages or sealings to women with living husbands was a way to obey plural marriage without not having to go practice it to the full extent, having sexual relations. And his position would be that there is no unambiguous evidence or no strong evidence of sexual polyandry, and that these were eternity only sealings, that they continued to live with their husbands, but that Joseph Smith would be sealed to them in the next life, which could be troubling for the ones who were active Latter-day Saints. You kind of think, why was Joseph being sealed to them? But so in his view, there isn't strong evidence of sexual polyandry, and I think that would be troubling if there was, because it sort of goes against Doctrine and Covenants 132 about marrying virgins and not marrying a woman who's vowed to another man. But what is your take on polyandry? Do you think that there's evidence to support it? Do you think it's sort of a bit ambiguous? What's your take on that?
Well, in the sense, it depends on how you define polyandry. In the sense that a woman was married to two men at the same time, it was definitely polyandry.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, Ena was married to Henry Jacobs and having kids with Henry Jacobs. She had two sons. And at the same time, she was married to Joseph Smith. She had been married to Joseph Smith. So some people, if you define polyandry as marriages that are exactly the same, it wasn't polyandry. In other words, the marriage to Henry Jacobs was a legal marriage, and the marriage to Joseph Smith was a non-legal marriage. It was a marriage for time and eternity. And so it had that eternity element that the marriage to Henry Jacobs didn't have.
Right.
And so they were different kinds of marriages. So in that sense, in other words, if you were looking at it purely from the view of how things will be in the eternities, it was not polyandry because the marriage to Henry Jacobs was not for eternity. So now, the major disagreement Brian and I have in a lot of things where we agree, and his list of marriages is quite similar to mine. I think he adds two.
Yeah.
But on this idea that there were marriages for eternity only, I haven't found any evidence that convinces me that there were marriages for eternity only. And I decided to define marriages as if there was a marriage ceremony, you could call it a marriage. And so for all of these 33, I believe there was a marriage ceremony. And for Fanny Alger, we have that Mosiah Hancock document that specifically mentions there was a marriage ceremony. And so I put a lot of emphasis on the marriage ceremony, and I've found not just in Nauvoo polygamy, but in Utah polygamy, I haven't found good evidence for marriages for eternity only, and I haven't found any marriage ceremony for eternity only. Now, one of the things that's happened is some of the women, they referred to their marriages and they said, I was married for eternity to Joseph Smith.
Yes.
But then in another place, they said, I was married for time and eternity to Joseph Smith, the same woman talking about the same marriage. And so there's different ways you can look at it. You can say that, oh, she was just careless when she said time and eternity. It was really for time, for eternity only. Or you can say they were referring to the same marriage and just the way I look at it, they were all marriages for time and eternity, and sometimes they emphasized eternity. Okay, so some people like Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, who was polyandrous marriage,
Yeah.
with Joseph Smith. So she later in her life she gave talks and affidavits and so on about her marriage to Joseph Smith, and an autobiography. And one time she said, I was married to Joseph Smith for eternity. And so some people have leapt on that and said, look at this. Here she was married. She doesn't say eternity only. She just says eternity. But they take that one piece of evidence, say, look, here's a polyandrous marriage. She was married to him for eternity only. However, you look at her other documents, and like 3 or 4 other places she said, I was married to Joseph Smith for time and eternity. Okay, so I think at the least you need to say there's contradictory evidence,
Right.
really important contradictory evidence. And the people who just say, oh, said she was married for eternity, they're not doing that. So that's bad scholarship, to not look at the contradictory evidence. And so my view is that the marriage ceremonies, as far as we can document them, were always for time and eternity.
Okay.
So
I think probably one of the most controversial sort of accounts is that of is Josephine Lyon Sessions, daughter of Sylvia Sessions, who claimed that her mother told her on her deathbed that she was the daughter of Joseph Smith. And I think it was believed that she was the biological daughter of Joseph Smith until DNA testing proved that she wasn't. And then so some apologists would say, okay, well, then maybe she wasn't the biological daughter, maybe just, adopted daughter, which means, Sylvia and Joseph didn't have a sexual polyandrous relationship. Some critics might say, well, maybe there was both, and she thought Joseph Smith was the husband. It's a little bit ambiguous, but would you, if you believe that there are time and eternity marriages, do you believe that there might have been sexual relations with some of those polyandrous wives?
well, I believe with marriage, if there was a marriage, it's like the burden of proof is on people to say there was not
Right.
sexual relations, because that's just a normal part of marriage. And so it isn't the burden of proof on people to prove that there were sexual relations. I think the burden of proof is to document that there were no sexual relations.
Okay.
And Nauvoo polygamy was different than Utah polygamy in that it was secret. It was very secret.
Yeah.
And Joseph Smith's situation, he was dealing with a very unsympathetic first wife. And so um, it was very different. Now, with the Josephine Fisher affidavit, and so Sylvia Sessions, again, was one of these polyandrous wives. She was married to Windsor Lyon when she was married to Joseph Smith. And so on her deathbed, she brought her daughter, Josephine Lyon, who later married a Fisher, and told her that Josephine, was the daughter of Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
So I take that as evidence that Sylvia believed Josephine was the daughter of Joseph Smith. So obviously there were sexual relations. Um, Now, with the DNA research, I'm not a scientist, so it's really, I don't know how to assess it. As far as I know with history, it's like you show your evidence, and then other historians can look at the evidence and see if they think it's good evidence.
Yeah.
But not being a scientist, I can't do that. I really don't know. I know that doing the DNA assessment through a woman is more difficult, and I think I think it was kind of experimental when they did this project on the daughter of Sylvia Sessions, Josephine Lyon. So I provisionally accept it, but I don't know how to evaluate it, not being a scientist.
Right.
But as I do provisionally accept it, what I think happened then is that Windsor was the father of Josephine. And so Sylvia Sessions was having relations with Windsor and Joseph Smith. That's how I view it with the
Right.
evidence we have.
I think I know an apologist will say, well, there's no way because that would constitute adultery under D&C 132 and Joseph couldn't have done that, or the wives couldn't have done. Well, I suppose he could have. Um, any quick response to that? Who apologists that would say, well, there's no way he would have committed sexual polyandry because that would have been adultery, and he would have been almost going against the revelation he received.
Well, again, as I say, I accept that that's a normal part of marriage.
Right.
And it shouldn't be controversial. And I think if you have really good, solid evidence to say where the woman says, I was married to Joseph Smith in an eternity only marriage,
Yeah.
that would be good, solid evidence. I don't know of any evidence like that.
And we
So,
know that having children, multiplying and replenishing the earth was one of the main purposes of polygamy. I think,
yeah.
restoration of all things and it being a trial, and for exaltation in the next life, for three others laid out in Doctrine and Covenants 132. And we do have affidavits and statements from some of the wives that are very strong evidence that there were sexual relations. What do you think of the marriage between Joseph and Helen Mar Kimball? She's the 14-year-old. She wrote a lot about polygamy, as defender of polygamy. She talks about it in her journal, being sealed to the prophets. Can you talk a little bit about her and their marriage and your take on that?
Yeah, let me just say briefly. So Brian Hales and I have this major disagreement on whether there were eternity only marriages in Nauvoo. Specifically, he applies them to the polyandrous marriages.
Yes.
And however, I think in many ways, even though he's seen as a apologist, defender of Joseph Smith, and he is to a certain extent. I think in many ways he's done a great service in that, like some conservative church members would just ignore the whole issue, and they've been doing that for many years. Just let's not talk about Joseph Smith and his plural wives.
Yeah.
And so it's great that he's done all he could to document it and accept that it happened and try to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, no, I admire I admire and respect his openness, all the research he's done, like joesmithpolygamy.org and Joe Smith's polygamy documents. Like he's transparent, he's open about it. He doesn't hide back from anything, and he's confronted it, and yeah, he should be respected, his take on it.
And I just heard him speak at the John Whitmer conference in Independence, Missouri, and he said if he could go back to Joseph Smith and whisper in his ear and suggest that he not do certain things,
Yeah.
that and he had a list, I think 4, and I think I remember 3 of them, but one was he would have been told Emma about all the marriages. He wouldn't have hid the marriages from Emma. Another was that he wouldn't have married women who were married to other men. And but another one, he said he wouldn't have married young teenagers.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I agree that it was, marrying Helen Mar Whitney was 14 years old when she married Joseph Smith. And so I think this was not a good, it was unwise. I agree with Brian on that. However, again, with this idea, this business of were there sexual relations, I kind of take a moderate point of view on that. And I know in Utah there were kind of similar situations, parallel situations, where a man married a woman or a girl when she was very young, 14 or 15, something like that, but then did not have relations, and kids until later when they were 19 or something like that. And so I think it's possible that that pattern would have been followed in Nauvoo. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, however, what I say is there is no evidence that there were sexual relations, and there's no evidence that there weren't sexual relations.
Ambiguous.
You know, um, but my personal point of view is that there probably weren't sexual relations.
I think I would lean that way. I know Brian talked about how she wasn't brought to the the meeting with the RLDS church, some of the wives testifying that they were, you know, polygamous wives of Joseph Smith to the full extent, and that she continued to live with, with her parents, and there's no record of her being alone with Joseph Smith. And it was her father, Heber, who I believe initiated it, wanting to be sealed to the prophet. But Helen wrote like her experiences. She felt like she was like a ewe lamb being sacrificed, and she, it affected her social life as well, even if there weren't sexual relations, which I would find troubling, a 37-year-old with a 14-year-old. But even if there wasn't, it seemed like it did have an impact on her, at least in her early teenage life.
Yeah, so I agree with all that, and we I call these marriages dynastic, where two prominent men wanted to get a connection, and they did it through the marriage of a daughter.
Yeah.
And so that's common throughout history, and like I have this background in Greco-Roman history, and that was happening all the time. If you were the daughter of a prominent Roman politician, you just expected to be married off, in the most politically advantageous way.
Yeah.
Okay. However, um, again, I don't think it was I don't think it was a good thing to put a teenage daughter in that situation, in that, you know,
Yeah.
using her to link families instead of going the way, she would want to go, choosing the person she would want to choose to marry.
Yeah.
And Joseph
Being able to
Smith,
date other boys, and she talked about like going to the dances that she felt like yeah, like she couldn't be like other 14, 15 year olds her age.
yeah. And Joseph Smith told her if she took this step and was married to him, it would bring about not only her complete exaltation, but the exaltation of her family.
Yes.
And what a burden to put on a 14-year-old girl. Um, so,
Yeah, because some
and she
people would
was,
see.
and when she discovered what this all meant, and it happened very quickly. And when she discovered what it all meant, she was very depressed. It was very
Yeah.
difficult for her. So, um,
Because a lot of people struggle with, and critics would point to Joseph seeming to have a pattern of, Helen Mar Kimball was different because it was initiated by her father, but she again felt that pressure, maybe the weight of, the eternal salvation of her family. When Joseph would propose marriages to certain women, I know Lucy Walker, she talks about how Joseph Smith pretty much said that he's been commanded to take another wife, and that she's the woman, and told her to pray about it. And after months, he sort of gave her 24 hours to make a decision, or else the gate would be closed. And people see his pattern of proposing to teenage girls as putting pressure on them, and you could maybe view it as coercion, them seeing him as this prophetic figure, and maybe a power imbalance. How do you view maybe Joe Smith's proposals of plural marriage to some of the teenagers like Lucy Walker or the Partridge sisters?
well, again, like if I were Brian Hales and I could go and whisper in his ear, I would say not just avoid these marriages to teenage girls, but not put them under the ban of secrecy.
Yeah.
Like Emily Partridge, he told her she couldn't tell anyone, not her sister, not her mother. Her father had passed away. And again, I think it would have been really important that a young girl, a teenage girl, have the counsel of her parents
Yes.
when she's entering a marriage like this. And so, again, some of the way it wasn't just that he was a polygamist. Some of the problem is how he practiced polygamy.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Especially, doing it without his wife's awareness, without her consent for a lot of them. And he would often write letters to some of the girls he was proposing to, I think was it Emily Partridge and was it Sarah Ann Whitney and her parents, to sort of like burn the letter after you would write to them.
yeah, that
So
was Sarah
it's all
Ann
very
Whitney.
secret.
Yeah. And Sarah Ann Whitney is really interesting because we have the actual marriage ceremony that was used. And I remember I told you I'm really interested in the marriage ceremony.
And the
And
words.
yeah, and again, there was the importance in that marriage ceremony. There's reflects the offspring was a very important part of this polygamous marriage.
Mm.
And so yeah, and the title in my book was In Sacred Loneliness, and so I kind of found this fascinating contrast between, it's kind of like a paradoxical contrast between this high religious ideal of polygamy, and obviously polygamy was later in Utah, it was seen as one of the foundational doctrines of Mormonism,
Yeah.
and that you had to take part in it to get the highest exaltation. Okay. On the other hand, it was very difficult, and I found over and over again this pattern among women that they were kind of deserted. And if you think about what polygamy is like, it isn't one-on-one monogamy where they live together, they share all of their financial resources. With polygamy, if a man is married to 20 women, his financial resources are divided into 20. And then you take into consideration that sometimes there was a favorite wife, and so she would often get a bigger part of this financial division. And
So a lot of them were very poor and
and
experienced poverty.
yeah, it was a financial struggle.
Uh,
Even Emily Partridge, who was married to Brigham Young, the richest man in the territory, and also the the husband couldn't spend as much time with each family, obviously, if he's got 20 families. And so I found this fascinating paradox that I express in that title, sacred. It was viewed as sacred, necessary for the highest salvation. And on
yeah.
the other hand, it was loneliness, and add with that financial,
Because whenever
separation
you
of
read
financial resources.
because when you read some of the accounts, some of them do claim to have had, spiritual experiences, and they felt like they received a testimony, like in the Lucy Walker account, or I think Sarah Ann Whitney and her parents. But there was
Mary
also
Elizabeth
that,
Rollins. Yeah,
yeah,
Mary
with
Elizabeth
the
Rollins
she
liked
saw
her.
the angel, didn't she? She claimed to see the
Yeah.
angel, and it's like they wrestled, and there was emotional turmoil, and they really struggled with it, and then they probably felt, yeah, really lonely, like it was a huge burden on them, a huge sacrifice. But then so many of them claim to have spiritual experiences, which some people would just dismiss, because lots of people in lots of religions like FLDS maybe have claimed spiritual experiences, but at the same time, that's part of these women's stories and their accounts as well.
So yeah, so it was uh, a real psychological struggle for some of these women who had bad experiences with polygamy, and yet were totally supportive of it as a doctrine of the church.
Yeah.
And you really see that in the Emily Partridge Young diaries, because she had a very bad experience with Brigham Young as a plural wife, and not being financially supported. And yet she accepted him as a prophet. She accepted polygamy because Joseph Smith had revealed it. She had a bad experience with Joseph Smith with polygamy too.
Yeah,
And
she didn't
yet,
want to do it.
as a faithful Mormon, she supported polygamy. And you
So they both
find
saw
this,
it as a religious practice and a commandment for them to
yeah,
obey this this ordinance as well to partake of. No, I think Emma Smith, probably of nearly all the wives, is probably the one who struggled the most with it. You know, we know that she didn't react well to Fanny Alger, Emily, and Eliza Partridge, that her and Joseph had some marital tensions. You know, D&C 132, the language from the Lord, if you believe it was from the Lord, towards Emma is can seem quite harsh. You know, threats of destruction or damnation if she pretty much doesn't submit to this law, the law of polygamy, and accept Joseph Smith's wives. And she, like we alluded to earlier, wasn't aware for, I think, the first 20 or so wives of Joseph Smith. How do you feel about Emma Smith and what she had to endure with Joseph Smith's polygamy?
well, that's a really, really fascinating story. And of course, for the whole story, you need to read the book by Linda King Newell and Valine Tippett Avery, both of whom were, really supportive of In Sacred Loneliness and helped me with it
Yeah.
um, back then for the full story. But it's a really interesting story in that in Utah, what I call practical polygamy in Utah, the first wife accepted polygamy, and I guess she had the choice, either accept it or maybe leave Mormonism. And so, like the first wife of Brigham Young accepted his plural family, and same with Heber C. Kimball. And so Emma is a big contrast to that. She never, like at times it seems like she accepted it, like she picked out Emily and Eliza Partridge to be his wives. But I think when she found out what the marriage would be like, if, like sexual relations with Joseph and Emily and Eliza, she quickly had required Joseph Smith to kick them out of the house. And she wanted them to go to a different city. She didn't just want them to leave the house. And so it depends on how you view polygamy, how you view Emma
Yeah.
Smith. And if you don't like polygamy, I guess she would be a hero, but if you
Or a
do accept,
victim.
and of course,
Yeah.
the people in Utah in 1800s totally accepted polygamy as an important part of the doctrine of the church. And so when she said that Joseph Smith did not give D&C 132 and did not practice polygamy himself, of course, that made her an enemy to them. And so you have this big tension between Brigham Young and Emily and Emma Smith. So it's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of surprised that we don't have any good novelists who've taken up some of this story of polygamy and written books about it. Though Giant Joshua is polygamy in southern Utah.
Oh,
I think
okay.
the stories of people like Zina Diantha Huntington Smith Young and
Mm.
Emily Partridge Smith Young would make great novels.
Yeah.
They're wonderful stories, and so hopefully the drama gets through in my In Sacred Loneliness.
Yeah.
of these women, though I haven't focused on Emma. And so for that, read Mormon Enigma
Yes.
by Valine Tibbetts Avery and Linda King Newell. I'm going to have to go before too long.
Yeah.
Could I talk a little bit about this book?
Yeah. Talk about that book and any closing thoughts you want to give
Yeah,
on.
and maybe I'll read a
Polygamy.
couple things from this. But
Yeah.
the way this book came to be was holding up all my books here. Was Joe Geisner asked me to write a story, essay for this book about how I had first come to write in Sacred Loneliness. And so as I was writing the essay for Joe Geisner's book, I was looking through for like letters I'd written and letters people had written to me, and I was going through my computer files. And as I was doing that, I found a lot of the documents that I'd transcribed. And when I was doing the research for In Sacred Loneliness, which was like, what, 1993 to 1996, the internet was in its infancy. And so you really couldn't use the internet to do research. And what I would do is I would go around to the different libraries, different archives, and you just take your laptop and you type the documents. And so if it's a short document, you can type the whole thing. So a little autobiography or a letter, I just type the whole thing. And if it's a long document, you type excerpts, the most important excerpts, you read them. And
Yeah.
so I had a lot of these documents on my computer, and I'd always thought, these are important documents, they ought to be published. And so I I was corresponding with Gary Bergera at Signature Books, and I ran the idea past him, and he was positive about it, of publishing a lot of these documents that these women had written. And so I began collecting them and annotating them. And so the book finally came out. It came out earlier this year.
Yeah.
From Signature Books again. And so it is, as I mentioned earlier, it's only things written by the women themselves. And so I had to leave out like things written by the brother of Zina, even though that was a really good piece of evidence. It wasn't written by her. So I made this judgment only written by the women. And so it starts with Louisa Beaman's letters, and she was the first woman who was married in Nauvoo. And so one of the great things about this book is I quote liberal I quote liberally from these documents in the first In Sacred Loneliness. But for this second In Sacred Loneliness, the documents, often I was able to include the whole document. If there's a letter, I included the whole document. If there's a short autobiography, I included the whole document. If there were longer diaries, like Patty Sessions or Eliza R. Snow, then I included excerpts. But I tried to include, like for Eliza R. Snow, like her early Salt Lake City diaries.
Yeah.
And so that section was complete. And so it was a lot of fun to do. And I did a lot of research, looking up names, which is the way I'd started at the Huntington Library. And so what I like about it is you have the complete document. And often, especially with your reading something controversial, you're saying, oh, okay, he's quoting this. What is right in front of it? What is right behind it? Because often when you do that, it makes your view of that quote is different.
It's good to have the full quote in context.
Sometimes the historian hasn't, just by doing that small quote, he doesn't give you the real point of view of the author. And so for my book, you can actually read the whole, like the Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner diary, autobiography. It's a wonderful document. She's a great storyteller, and she talks about her marriage to Joseph Smith as a polyandrous plural wife. And so I quote parts of that in the first In Sacred Loneliness, but here you can read the whole thing. You can see the whole context. And so, it's very valuable. Plus, you get the voices of these women in a more complete way. And so
that's so important.
Yeah, and that's kind of really made me fall in love with doing this project in the first place, was how much I enjoyed the things they'd written, their diaries and autobiographies and letters. And so that's what's going on with this second book, In Sacred Loneliness, the documents.
I love it.
And if it's okay with you, could I read a couple things from it?
Of course. I'd love to hear it.
Okay. Let's see, what's the best way of doing that? Okay, I've been having these, let's see, I've been having can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Okay, I've been having these readings when I've like at Sunstone, like I talk about how I came to write the book,
Mm-hmm.
In Sacred Loneliness, the diaries. And okay, I'm looking for one thing here. But I've had women help me read from the books, certain passages. And so me reading this will not be as good as a woman reading it, but okay, so this is on page 127. Okay. So I did a lot of, one of the wives of Joseph Smith was Agnes Coolbrith, Smith Pickett. There's 4 marriages there.
Wow.
And she ended up in California in the gold rush, and she had a daughter named, whose name was Josephine Donna Smith. And Agnes had married Joseph Smith's brother, Don Carlos Smith. And so Josephine was the daughter of Don Carlos Smith and Agnes Coolbrith. And Don Carlos died, and Agnes ended up marrying this guy named Pickett, and they came to California during gold rush days. And Josephine became a famous writer, a famous poetess in California under the pen name Ena Coolbrith. And so I found some of her letters that she wrote when she was like 15 or 16 to her cousin, Joseph F. Smith, who later became the president of the LDS Church.
Mm.
And he was a daughter of Hiram.
Yeah.
So anyway, they had, one of their disputes was about polygamy. And for some reason, Josephine had a very negative view of polygamy. And so here's what she wrote in a letter she wrote in 1857. She was living in LA. And she said to Joseph F., is it right for a girl of 15 and even 16 to marry a man of 50 or 60? Can there be any love there? And has not God willed a woman to love, honor, and obey her husband? And can it be right thus to pledge false vows at the altar in perfect mockery of all that is good and pure in God's most holy laws? I think I see myself vowing to love and honor some old dribbling idiot of 60, to be taken into his harem and enjoy the pleasure of being his favorite sultana for an hour, and then thrown aside whilst my godly husband is out sparking another girl in hopes of getting another victim to his despotic power. Pleasant prospect, I must say. And this, Joe, this is of God, is it? No, never, never, never. And so she underlined the first no, never, and double underlined, never, never.
Wow.
You may preach, you may talk to me from now to eternity, but you never will make me believe that polygamy is true. So I don't know what caused her to have this point of view, but
Wow, she is very strong in.
and she was you can tell she was brilliant at that age and her mother, when
Did you
she
say
wrote
she
her
was
letters,
15? What age was she? 15?
yeah, I think 15 or 16.
Wow.
She was starting to publish. And now I feel like I have to represent the other side. So here's an excerpt from.
And that's a quote you would rarely hear about. I don't think I know much about her, and it's amazing just to hear her strong perspective as a teenager in, Mormon polygamy.
Uh-huh. So here's another point of view of polygamy. And this was Eliza Partridge. And Elijah Partridge Smith Lyman, she ended up married to Amasa Lyman, who eventually left the church. He was an apostle, but he was left the church. And so he was married to, what was it, 3 Partridge sisters, and they all left him when he became a spiritualist and left the church. That's a whole nother story, but so, but she had a difficult experience with polygamy in his family, which comes through in her diary. And however, in 1879, a bunch of non-Mormon women in Utah started this anti-polygamy society and attacked polygamy. And so in response, women all over Utah got together and had these pro-polygamy meetings. And so Eliza was living in the Fillmore area, and so they had which is kind of central Utah, and so they had a pro-polygamy meeting to defend polygamy, and they asked Eliza to speak. And so she was totally willing to do so. And so she wrote a speech, and she included the speech in her diary. And here's a quote. It is now about 31 years since the prophet Joseph Smith taught to me the principles of celestial marriage. I was then married by that order and have raised a family of both sons and daughters in what is called polygamy. And I am not afraid to say that it is one of the most pure and holy principles that has ever been revealed to the Latter-day Saints, and one that is necessary to our exaltation. The anti-polygamists say the laws of celestial marriage are a curse to our children. Will they be kind enough to tell us where it is any disadvantage to them? We are not afraid to compare our children with those born and raised in monogamy. Perhaps they do not know that the Lord reserved some of the most noble spirits to come forth in the last days, to perform the great work which he has begun on earth, and which he will consummate in spite of all opposing influences. So there's a pretty standard defense of polygamy,
Wow.
mentioning that it's necessary to our highest salvation. And it shows, the two perspectives, the
Yeah.
standard Mormon perspective and Ena Coolbrith writing in Los Angeles.
And it's so great to hear their perspectives of polygamy, to hear their voice. And that's the great thing about, your book and this recent book, the documents where you're capturing the words and the writings of the wives of Joseph Smith and their experience.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Stephen. And it's great to hear that from an Irish person after spending my mission there.
Yeah.
Let me just read one more little passage, and this one It's Louisa Beaman telling about how um, her children died in early Salt Lake City. And so she had married, she was the first plural wife of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, and so she was an important historical character for that period, for that reason. And then after Joseph Smith died, she married Brigham Young and began to have children. And her first children with Brigham Young, it was a pair of twins, and they were born as the Mormons were leaving Nauvoo, and they died as children. And then again, she had another child in winter quarters, and this child also died. And then, as she was crossing the plains, she had a pair of twins, the final pair of twins. And so she was writing a letter back to her close friend, Miranda Johnson Hyde, who was also a wife of Joseph Smith. And she told the story of these last kids that she had. And she wrote, oh, and by the way, when I've had my sister read these in the one of my sisters read these in these readings, and it's kind of hard to get through because it's such a sad story. And when I've tried to read this previously, it's hard not to break down. So we'll see how I do this time. Okay. Louisa wrote, I am led to think at times there is not much else but sorrow and affliction in this world for me. The next day after I arrived in the valley, my babes were both taken sick with the bowel complaint. The canker set in, and on the 11th of October, I was called upon to give up the oldest one, and his little spirit took its flight to join with his brothers and Father in heaven. My anxiety was all turned towards the other that was living. The next day after this one was buried, the other commenced to get better. He got so that he seemed well and grew fleshy as fast as ever I saw a child, and I even dared to hope that I should raise him. But I no sooner hoped than my hopes were all blasted. One day, all in a moment, as it were, he was taken down again with the same complaint. And all I could do, both by faith and works, did not seem to do any good. And on the 16th of November, he breathed his last, and I was again left alone. You that have been mothers and lost children can better imagine my feelings than I can describe them. I had fondly hoped I should raise them. They looked very much alike indeed. Their eyes were just of a color. I called them Alva and Alma, but they are gone, and I must be reconciled to the will of God. And I desire ever to acknowledge his hand in all things. I look forward to the time when I shall again behold them and clasp them to my bosom. Will not my joy be full? I feel as though it would. I desire to bear all of my afflictions with patience, realizing that my heavenly Father knows better what is for my good than myself. And I feel to submit all things into his hands and say his will be done and not mine.
Wow,
So
that's beautiful.
I know before I found these letters, I knew her just as kind of like a name. And so when I read this letter, all of a sudden she was this real living person.
Yeah, it's powerful
And
and sad and devastating. The the true hardship and loss and sorrow that she experienced with losing so many of her children, and the faith as well. Like I feel like she almost describes like the title of your book, like true loneliness but sacred loneliness of experiencing not just polygamy but like losing her children and experiencing so much, but her faith and love for God is so, it's admirable and inspiring. in many ways.
Yes, and thank you for this whole interview and your very insightful comments. So
Yeah, thank you so much for
it's
coming on, and to talk about your book and to talk about the wives of Joseph Smith and polygamy. And it's been great meeting you and connecting and talking about Ireland, and having you on.
yeah, it's been great for me too.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone so much for watching this great interview with historian Todd Compton. Check out his book In Secret Loneliness and his new book In Secret Loneliness: The Documents. I'll put links in the description. You can also check him out. He's been on other podcasts like Gospel Tangents and Mormon Stories. And I hope that you've appreciated this. If you have, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, so you don't miss any future content and interviews I have coming. Thank you so much, Todd.
Okay, thank you.